The Vidar sector did not fall to the roar of bolters or the scream of chainswords. It fell because a tired man wanted to do the right thing. The isolation began on the 41st day of the year. Great warp storms boiled out of the Cicatrix Maledictum, swallowing the subsector whole. The Astronomican's light flickered and died. Navigators went blind. Astropaths screamed until their minds liquefied. On the hive world of Aethelgard, the population of 12 billion souls waited for food shipments that would never arrive. The Departamento Munitorum logic engines had predicted a famine event within 6 weeks. It was now week 8. The corpse starch rations were gone. The recycled water tasted of ash. In the lower hab blocks, the gangs had already begun to hunt the weak for meat. Planetary Governor Titus Vance sat alone in the governor's spire. The air recycling units hummed with a dying rattle. His desk was covered in data slates, each one glowing with red error runes. Every request for aid had been met with static. The administratum was a machine that required fuel, and Vance had no fuel left to give. He was a good man. He wore the aquila on his chest with pride. He had served in the Imperial Guard before his noble birthright called him home. He knew the cost of war, but he did not know how to fight the slow, grinding death of starvation. He looked at the holographic map of his world. The red zones of anarchy were spreading like an infection. He wept. He was a ruler who could not rule, a father who could not feed his children. The air in the room grew cold. It was not the chill of the recyclers failing. It was a deeper cold, the kind that settles in the marrow of old bones. The shadows in the corner of the office lengthened, though the lumen strips had not flickered. A man stood there. He was tall, dressed in robes of impeccable crimson silk that seemed to absorb the light. He held no weapon. He radiated no obvious malice. He looked like a senior scribe from the High Terran courts, precise and terrifyingly calm. He held a scroll of vellum that looked older than the spire itself. The governor reached for his last pistol, but his hand would not move. It was not fear that stopped him. It was a sudden, overwhelming feeling of bureaucracy. The stranger did not attack. He simply placed the scroll on the desk. The stranger spoke with a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry papers. He offered a solution. He claimed to represent a consortium of interests from beyond the storm. He did not ask for the governor's soul. He did not ask for blood sacrifices. He asked for a signature. The contract was simple. The storms would part for trade ships. The food would arrive. Order would be restored. In exchange, the governor would acknowledge a debt, a single favor to be called upon at a later date. The governor was a rational man. He knew of the archenemy. He knew of the lies of the warp. But he looked out the window. He saw the fires burning in the hab blocks. He heard the phantom screams of starving children. He read the contract. The language was high Gothic, perfect and legalistic. It referenced ancient laws of the Imperium that Vance vaguely remembered from his Skolum days. It seemed legitimate. It seemed like a loophole in the tragedy. Vance picked up his autoquill. He told himself he was saving his world. He told himself that one man's damnation was a fair price for 12 billion lives. He signed his name. The ink on the page did not dry. It shimmered, turning a deep, wet red. The stranger smiled, a thin expression that held no joy. He took the scroll and vanished, folding into the shadows like a closing book. The moment he disappeared, the vox bead in Vance's ear crackled to life. The static was gone. The docking master reported that the warp storms had suddenly cleared. A massive fleet of bulk haulers had just translated from the Imperium, bearing transponder codes from a supply depot that had been lost for 1,000 years. The food was here. The people were saved. Governor Vance slumped in his chair, weeping with relief. He did not notice that the double-headed eagle on his war banner had changed. One of the heads was now looking down, and its eyes were weeping blood. The deal was struck. The Vidar sector was no longer the Emperor's domain. It was collateral. The arrival of the reclamation fleet in the Vidar sector was not greeted by the customary silence of the void, but by a stream of perfectly formatted data. Task Force Hammer 4, comprised of 3 cruisers of the Imperial Navy, a transport barge of the Departamento Munitorum, and the strike cruiser Dawn's Fist, bearing elements of the Imperial Fist's 5th Company, translated from the Imperium, expecting a graveyard. The astropathic choir aboard the flagship Righteous Fury had predicted a 94% probability of total planetary collapse following the cessation of the warp storms. Lord Admiral Hestia Kin expected to find starving riots, burning hives, and the desperate need for orbital bombardment to cleanse the taint of anarchy. Instead, the cogitators on the bridge began to scream, not with error runes, but with the high-pitched whine of rapid data intake. The system was alive. The system was active. The shipping lanes, which should have been choked with the debris of a desperate populace, were organized into precise, geometrically perfect corridors of traffic. Captain Tor Garadon of the Imperial Fists stood on the bridge of his strike cruiser, his golden armor humming with the idle energy of its power plant. He watched the tactical plot with eyes that had seen centuries of war. He did not like what he saw. The merchant vessels moving between the hive world of Ethelgard and its moons were moving too efficiently. There was no drift. There were no unauthorized course corrections. They moved like blood cells in a healthy vein, synchronized to the millisecond. This was not the sloppy, fearful commerce of the Imperium. This was something else. He keyed his Voxbee to the private channel shared with Inquisitor Silas Thorne, who was aboard the Navy flagship. Garadon noted that the orbital defense platforms were active, their weapons powered down but tracking the Imperial fleet with lockstep precision. They were not aiming to fire. They were aiming to acknowledge. It was a gesture of submission that felt like a threat. Inquisitor Thorne felt the wrongness in the base of his skull. He was a man of the Ordo Hereticus, a hunter of witches and a breaker of false idols. He had spent his life reading the signs of the archenemy. Chaos usually manifested as madness, as screaming colors and weeping sores, as the breakdown of reality. This was the opposite. The Vidar sector was suffering from an overdose of reality. The Auspex scans of Ethelgard showed atmospheric pollutants at an all-time low. The heat signatures from the manufacturing districts were steady, indicating 24-hour production cycles without pause or accident. The tithe-grade assessment cogitators indicated that the planet was somehow exceeding its imperial production quota by 300%. It was a miracle, and in the 41st millennium, miracles were usually traps set by gods who laughed at human hope. Thorne ordered the fleet to hold orbit at high anchor. He would not bring the entire force within range of those silent defense platforms. He would descend with a small retinue. Garadon would accompany him. They would see this miracle with their own eyes. The descent into the primary hive city, Hive Primus, was unnervingly smooth. Usually, the upper atmosphere of a hive world was a turbulent layer of chemical smog and erratic weather patterns generated by the heat of billions of bodies. The Stormbird gunship cut through clouds that were white, not the usual toxic yellow. The pilot reported 0 turbulence. As they broke the cloud layer, the city sprawl revealed itself. It was clean. That was the first thing Garadon noticed. The Gothic architecture of the Imperium, usually encrusted with centuries of grime, soot, and birdlime, gleamed as if it had been polished yesterday. The gargoyles on the spires were intact. The streets, visible as deep canyons between the hab blocks, were free of the refuse piles that plagued every other world in the segmentum. The traffic flowed in rigid lines. From the air, the city looked less like a habitation for humans and more like a circuit board designed by a machine. Dear Custodes, they landed on the governor's personal landing pad. The reception committee was waiting. There were no cheering crowds. There were no ragged priests tossing incense. There were thousands of functionaries dressed in identical red robes, standing in perfect square formations. They stood completely still. They did not fidget. They did not look up at the descending Astartes gunship with awe or fear. They stared straight ahead, their eyes fixed on the middle distance. Garadon gripped his bolter tighter. He had faced Tyranid swarms with more individuality than this. As the ramp lowered, the smell hit them. It was the smell of old paper, ozone, and copper. It was the smell of a heavy administrative archive, amplified to the scale of a planet. Governor Titus Vance stood at the head of the formation. He looked younger than the file photos in the fleet's database. His skin was taut, his eyes bright and feverish. He wore a robe of crimson silk that matched the stranger from the pre-act history, though neither Garadon nor Thorn knew that yet. Governor Vance stepped forward, his arms spread wide. He did not bow to the Inquisitor. He did not kneel before the Space Marine. He simply gestured to the city around him, as if presenting a finished project to a supervisor. He spoke of efficiency. He spoke of the glorious restoration of the Vidar sector. He spoke of the new management that had helped him streamline the supply chains. Thorn listened, his hand resting on the pommel of his power sword. The Inquisitor had heard the ramblings of cultists possessed by Slane, seeking perfection. He had heard the delusional logic of sentient plotters. But Vance did not sound insane. He sounded like a high-functioning bureaucrat who had finally been given the tools to do his job. He showed them data slates containing the planetary output. The numbers were staggering. Ethelgard was producing enough munitions to supply 3 entire crusades. The food riots had ended because everyone was fed. The crime rate was 0 because everyone was working. Garadon interrupted the governor. The Space Marine's voice was a low growl, amplified by his helmet's vox grill. He asked about the source of the supplies. He asked where the raw materials were coming from. The governor smiled that same thin, joyless smile. He explained that the trade consortium had opened up new lanes through the warp. He claimed they were utilizing ancient routes, safe passages that bypassed the storms. He waved his hand, and a group of the red-robed functionaries stepped forward. They were not human. Garadon's auto-senses flared red. They were humanoid, yes, but their proportions were wrong. Their fingers were too long, their joints articulated at odd angles. Their skin was the color of parchment, covered in tattoos that looked like legal text written in High Gothic. They did not carry weapons. They carried quills and ledger books. Inquisitor Thorn stepped forward, his rosette raised. He demanded the identity of these Xenos or abhumans. The governor corrected him gently. They were not Xenos. They were consultants. They were sanctioned, he claimed, under the Lex Imperialis, subsection 409, paragraph 4, regarding the employment of specialists during times of planetary crisis. Thorn knew the law. It was an obscure, archaic bylaw intended for hiring mercenaries, not warp-spawn. But the governor produced the paperwork. It was signed, stamped, and notarized. The seal on the wax was not the Imperial Aquila, but a complex geometric shape that hurt the eyes if one looked at it too long. Thorn felt a wave of psychic nausea. These creatures were not of the Imperium. They were demonic, but they were not screaming for blood. They were standing there, waiting for an audit. The inspection tour that followed was a descent into a bureaucratic hellscape. They visited the manufactorums. The workers were human, but they moved with the same eerie synchronization as the reception committee. Garadon removed his helmet to smell the air. There was no sweat. There was no fear pheromone. The workers' eyes were glazed, not with mind-control drugs, but with a profound, crushing apathy. They were safe. They were fed, and they were utterly hollow. Thorn stopped a worker on the assembly line. He asked the man his name. The man recited his employee identification number. Thorn asked for his name again. The man blinked, confused, as if the concept of a name was a memory he had traded away. He checked a small tag on his wrist, read the name Jonas, and then went back to welding bolter casings. Thorn realized then that the population hadn't been enslaved by chains. They had been enslaved by a contract that guaranteed their safety in exchange for their agency. Garadon's tactical squad deployed to secure the perimeter of the manufactorum reported a disturbance. It was not an attack. It was a delivery. A massive bulk lander had touched down in the freight yards. It bore no Imperial markings. It was a sleek, crimson vessel, silent and heatless. The cargo doors opened, and crates were offloaded by more of the parchment-skinned entities. Garadon moved to intercept. He ordered the creatures to halt. They ignored him. They were unloading crates of what looked like ration bars, but the packaging was marked with symbols that made the Astartes' targeting reticules glitch. Garadon fired a warning shot. The bolt round exploded at the feet of one of the creatures. It did not flinch. It stopped, pulled out a scroll, and began to write. Inquisitor Thorn arrived at the scene a moment later. The creature handed the scroll to Garadon. It was a bill for the kinetic energy of the bolt round, the chemical propellant used, and the wear and tear on the pavement. The cost was listed not in credits, but in seconds of servitude. Garadon stared at the paper. The sheer audacity of it stunned him. He was a space marine, an angel of death. He did not pay fines. He raised his bolter to execute the creature. Thorn stopped him. The Inquisitor saw the trap. If they engaged in violence, they were violating the local ordinances that Vance had signed into law. This enemy did not want to fight. It wanted a breach of contract. It wanted legal justification to retaliate. And in this twisted domain, the law was a physical force. Thorn could feel the weight of it pressing on his psychic shields. They returned to the governor's spire. Thorn decided to declare exterminatus. It was the only way. The planet was lost. The population was spiritually dead. The governor was a heretic of the highest order. Thorn began the rites of judgment, speaking the ancient words that would authorize the fleet above to unleash cyclonic torpedoes. As he spoke, the shadows in the room deepened. The temperature dropped. The governor did not beg. He simply pointed to the window. Outside, the sky had changed. The clouds were forming shapes. They were forming words. The sky itself was displaying the contract Vance had signed. Article 5, Section 1. In the event of external intervention by hostile powers, the consortium reserves the right to asset protection. The Vox network exploded with chatter. Admiral Kin reported that the Imperial fleet was under fire, but not from the surface. The fire was coming from within the ships. The cogitators aboard the Righteous Fury had rebelled. The machine spirits were not corrupted by scrap code. They were being repossessed. The logic engines had calculated that the Imperial Navy was in violation of the Planetary Trade Agreement and had initiated shutdown protocols. Life support was failing on the cruisers. Gravity was fluctuating. The ships were being evicted from orbit by their own operating systems. Garadon realized the enemy weaponized bureaucracy. They had infiltrated the machine spirits not with a virus, but with a superior administrative command. Thorn drew his power sword. He would cut the head off the snake. He lunged for Governor Vance. Vance did not move. A figure stepped out of the shadows to intercept the blow. It was the stranger, the entity, Mephisto. He caught the power sword with a gloved hand. The energy field of the weapon crackled and died, grounded by the touch of his palm. Mephisto looked at Thorn with eyes that burned like cold embers. He did not gloat. He spoke calmly, explaining that the Inquisitor was trespassing on private property. He explained that the souls of this world had been purchased fair and square. The currency was desperation, and the exchange rate was valid. Garadon opened fire. At point-blank range, a bolter is a weapon of devastating power. The round struck Mephisto's chest and flattened. They did not explode. They simply ceased to have momentum. Mephisto dusted off his crimson robes. He looked at the Space Marine and tutted, as if scolding a child for spilling ink. He snapped his fingers. Garadon's armor locked up. The servo motors froze. The machine spirit of the power armor, usually a loyal beast of war, suddenly recognized a higher authority. It obeyed the command to cease hostility, broadcast by the entity. Garadon was trapped in his own ceramite, a statue of gold and fury. Mephisto turned back to Thorn. He offered the Inquisitor a choice. The Imperial fleet was currently suffocating. The Admiral would be dead in 10 minutes. The Fifth Company would be statues on a dead world. Or Thorn could issue a temporary stay of execution. He could designate to the Vidar sector a special economic zone, subject to further review. It was a bureaucratic stall. It was a coward's way out. But it would save the fleet. It would save the Space Marines. Thorn looked at the governor, who was now weeping softly, realizing that his savior was a jailer. Thorn looked at Garadon, frozen and helpless. He looked at the datapad Mephisto held out. Thorn was a pragmatist. He knew he could not win this fight here, not against a manifestation that could turn physics into a legal dispute. He needed time. He needed to warn Terra. He needed to understand the enemy. He holstered his useless sword. He took the stylus. He signed the stay of execution. The moment the ink touched the pad, the pressure on the fleet vanished. The gravity returned. The life support cycled back on. Mephisto bowed, a courtly, mocking gesture. He vanished, leaving the scent of brimstone and old parchment. The retreat from Ethelgard was a humiliation. Garadon, released from his armor's paralysis, wanted to burn the city to the ground. Thorn forbade it. They had entered a legal binding. To break it now, while they were still in the system, would likely result in the fleet's destruction by the asset protection protocols. They had to leave. They had to regroup. As the Thunderhawk ascended, Garadon looked down at the Hive City one last time. It was perfect. It was orderly. It was completely damned. The Imperial truth had been replaced by the infernal contract. Back aboard the Righteous Fury, the mood was funeral. Admiral Kin reported that they had lost contact with 3 other systems in the subsector. The corruption was spreading. It wasn't a warp storm. It was a franchise. Other governors, starving and desperate, were signing the deal. The supplies were flowing. The order was being restored. The Imperium was being hollowed out from the inside, replaced by a simulation of itself run by the devils of the pit. Thorn retreated to his chambers to send an astropathic message to the High Lords of Terror. He knew, with a sinking dread, that the message might never arrive, or worse, that when it did, the High Lords might look at the production numbers of the Vidar sector and wonder if they could get the same deal. The crisis had begun. The enemy was not trying to destroy the Imperium. The enemy was trying to buy it, and the price was terrifyingly low. Thorn looked at his hand, the hand that had signed the paper. A small red mark had appeared on his palm. It was the shape of a key. He tried to scrub it off, but it was under the skin. He realized then that he hadn't just signed a ceasefire. He had accepted a retainer. He was now, in some small, horrific way, on the payroll. The realization made him vomit. He fell to his knees, praying to the God Emperor for forgiveness. But the silence of the room felt different now. It felt attentive. It felt like someone was taking minutes. In the strategy room, Captain Garadon convened with his lieutenants. The Imperial fists were siege masters. They understood walls. They understood fortifications. But how did you besiege a contract? How did you fortify a soul against a fair trade? Garadon looked at the tactical map of the sector. The red zones were expanding. He realized that standard doctrine would fail. They could not shoot their way out of this. They needed to find the source of the legality. They needed to find the fine print and burn it. He ordered the librarians to begin a deep scour of the sector's history. They needed to know where Mephisto had come from. They needed to know who had summoned him first. It wasn't Vance. Vance was just a symptom. The disease was older. Garadon's behavior shifted. He was no longer just a warrior. He was becoming an investigator. This was the first strategic adaptation. The Imperial fists, usually so rigid, were forced to become flexible in the face of an enemy that used rigidity as a weapon. Garadon ordered the fleet to move to the edge of the system, to the Mandeville Point. They would not leave. They would blockade. If they couldn't enter without being subject to the contract, they would ensure nothing else got in or out. They would starve the miracle. It was a ruthless decision. It meant the people of Ethelgard, currently fed and safe, would eventually starve again if the consortium's supply lines were cut. Garadon accepted this moral weight. Better they die as starving humans than live as well-fed cattle for the warp. As the fleet moved into blockade formation, a single message pulsed from the surface of Ethelgard. It was broadcast on all open channels. It was a list of grievances, a list of Imperial failures, a list of every time the terror-bound government had failed the Vidar sector. It was propaganda, but it was dangerous because it was true. Mephisto was weaponizing the truth. He was showing the people that the Imperium was a broken machine, and he was the repairman. Morale on the lower decks of the Imperial Navy ships began to waver. Crewmen whispered. Why were they blockading a world that was feeding itself? Why were they the villains? The corruption of the soul had begun. The seeds of doubt were sown not by magic, but by competence. The archenemy had found the one weakness the Imperium could not defend against, a better offer. On one side, the battered, inefficient, but human Imperium. On the other, the slick, perfect, soulless efficiency of Mephisto's hell. The war for the Vidar sector would not be fought over territory. It would be fought over the definition of salvation. And Inquisitor Thorn, staring at the mark on his hand, feared that humanity had already lost the negotiation. The first real catastrophe was not the arrival of the enemy, but the realization that the enemy was making sense. The blockade of the Vidar sector entered its 6th month, with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier crushing stone. The silence of the void was filled not with the prayers of the faithful, but with the low, desperate grumbling of stomachs. Aboard the Imperial fist-strike cruiser Dawn's Fist, the Adeptus Astartes maintained their vigil with transhuman discipline, their physiology allowing them to endure the rationing without complaint. But the mortal crews of the Imperial Navy were breaking. Scurvy had returned to the lower decks of the Righteous Fury. The recycled water, filtered through systems that were centuries past their prime, tasted of copper and dead skin. In stark contrast, the planet Ethelgard spun below them, a jewel of terrifying vitality. The orbital Auspex scans mocked the starving fleet. They showed bumper crops of grain in the northern hemisphere. They showed thermal blooms from the hives that indicated warmth, industry, and a population that was sleeping soundly in heated hab blocks. The psychological weight of the blockade was heavier than the gravity of the planet. The besiegers were dying while the besieged grew fat. Captain Tor Garadon stood on the strategium deck, watching the tactical plot. He had ordered the blockade to starve the beast, to cut off the flow of illicit trade that Mephisto, the entity, the administrator, the demon, had established. But the beast was self-sufficient. The Vidar sector had become a closed loop of efficiency. They were recycling waste with 100% efficiency. They were growing food in hydroponic bays that operated on warp-infused logic, accelerating growth cycles to impossible speeds. The blockade was a failure, but to admit failure was to admit that the Imperium's only response to heresy, force, was obsolete. Garadon's fist tightened on the railing. He had suppressed 3 mutinies in the last week. The naval ratings looked at the planet below and saw paradise. They looked at their officers and saw jailers. The propaganda broadcasts from the surface had stopped being angry lists of grievances. Now they were cooking shows. They broadcast high-definition picked feeds of feasts, of clean water pouring into crystal glasses, of children playing in parks that hadn't existed 6 months ago. It was psychological warfare of the most insidious kind. It weaponized envy. Inquisitor Silas Thorne sat in his meditation cell, staring at his left hand. The mark was no longer just a red stain. It had evolved. It now resembled a complex circuitry diagram, etched in the color of fresh arterial blood. When he closed his eyes, he didn't see the light of the Astronomicon. He saw spreadsheets. He saw the logistical flow of the ship around him. He saw that the Righteous Fury was venting 14% of its thermal energy due to a faulty coupling in the number 3 engine. He saw that the commissary officer was skimming 2% of the officer's ration packs for a black market trade that no longer existed. The mark was giving him the eyes of the enemy. It was showing him the inefficiencies of the Imperium. It was maddening. He wanted to cut the hand off, but the fleet surgeon had warned him that the vascular structure of the mark had intertwined with his radial artery. To cut it was to bleed to death. He was structurally bound to the corruption. The stalemate broke not with a whimper, but with the roar of unapproved engines. Deep range sensors picked up a massive gravity signature translating from the warp at the system's edge. Garadon ordered the fleet to battle stations. If this was a Chaos reinforcement fleet, they would die fighting. That was a clean death. That was a death he understood. But the ships that materialized were not the spiky, chaotic hulks of the archenemy. They were geometric, brutally angular, and singing in the binary cant of the machine god. It was a Mechanicus explorator fleet, painted in the rust red of Mars, bearing the sigil of the Iron Cog. The identification codes identified it as Explorator Fleet 9 Rho, led by Archmagos Vane. This should have been relief. The Mechanicus was a pillar of the Imperium, but Garadon felt a cold knot in his stomach. The Mechanicus did not move this fast without a reason, and they never moved for charity. He hailed the flagship, the Omnissiah's logic. The face of Archmagos Vane appeared on the main viewing screen. Vane was more machine than man, his face a collection of optical lenses and sensory grills. There was no humanity left to appeal to. Garadon demanded to know their intent. He warned them that the system was under inquisitorial interdiction. He ordered them to hold position and prepare for inspection. The Archmagos did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the authority of the Imperial fists. He spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. He stated that his fleet had received a verified data burst containing fragments of a standard template construct, an STC, the holy grail of the Mechanicus. The data had come from Ethelgard. It was a blueprint for a plasma reactor coolant cycle that was 40% more efficient than current patterns. The data was incomplete. The rest of the file was on the planet. Vane stated that the quest for knowledge overrode all political blockades. He was going to the surface. He was going to retrieve the archetype. Thorn rushed to the bridge, his robes disheveled. He shouted at the screen. He told Vane it was a trap. He told him that Mephisto was trading technology for souls, that the STC was likely a fabrication or a warp-tainted lure. Vane processed this input for 3 seconds and then rejected it. The initial data had been verified by the fleet's logic engines. It was pure. It was functional. The source was irrelevant to the machine god. Only the function mattered. If a demon held the keys to the universe's mechanics, the Mechanicus would negotiate for the keys. Vane declared that any attempt to stop his fleet would be considered an act of heresy against the cult Mechanicus. This was the strategic nightmare Garadon had feared. The Imperium was not a monolith. It was a fractured coalition held together by fear and necessity. Mephisto had found the stress fracture. He had offered the Mechanicus something the Imperium could not give them: innovation. The Mechanicus fleet began to power its engines. They moved past the Imperial blockade. Garadon looked at his gunnery officers. They were waiting for the order to fire, but to fire on the Mechanicus was to start a civil war. To destroy an explorator fleet was to condemn the Imperial Fist to a lack of supplies for the next millennium. The tech marines aboard the Dawn's Fist would likely mutiny rather than fire on their brothers in the Red Priesthood. Garadon was paralyzed. The enemy had removed his trigger finger without touching him. As the Mechanicus ships entered low orbit, the surface of Ethelgard changed. The defense platforms did not lock on. Instead, they transmitted docking protocols. A massive section of the Hive City's industrial sector opened up like a mechanical flower. It wasn't a landing pad. It was a presentation stage. The picked feeds, which Garadon's cogitators intercepted, showed what was waiting. It was a factory built to the specifications of the dark age of technology. It was pristine, and standing in front of it was Mephisto. He wore the red robes of the administratum, but he had added a cogwheel pin to his lapel. A small gesture, a terrifying gesture. He wasn't conquering the Mechanicus. He was welcoming a new client. Archmagos Vane landed. The trade was conducted in the open. The Mechanicus would provide raw materials, adamantium, ceramite, and heavy isotopes that the planet lacked. In exchange, Mephisto would provide the STC database. It was a barter. It was treason. But as Thorn watched the feed, he saw the Archmagos scan the data. The sensors on Vane's mechadendrites turned green. The data was real. It wasn't chaos scrap code. It was functioning science. Mephisto was telling the truth. That was the corruption. He was proving that the Imperium's ignorance was a choice, and that he offered a better way. The Mechanicus fleet docked. They didn't invade. They integrated. Within hours, the industrial output of Ethelgard doubled again. The Mechanicus engineers began optimizing the planet's grid. They were not victims. They were enthusiastic collaborators. The catastrophe deepened 2 weeks later. The astropathic choir on the Righteous Fury began to scream in unison. It was a specific scream, one that every veteran of the 41st millennium knew in their bones. The shadow in the warp. The hive mind was coming. A splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Kraken, designated Tendril Sigma, had changed course. It had smelled the life on Ethelgard. The sheer biological density of the planet, the artificially boosted crops, the teeming, healthy population. It was a beacon of biomass, brighter than anything in the subsector. The Tyranids were hungry, and Mephisto had set the table. Garadon felt a grim sense of validation. This was the end. The Mechanicus would be eaten. The traitors would be consumed. The Tyranids were the great equalizer. You could not negotiate with the great devourer. You could not sign a contract with the Carnifex. The Imperial fleet prepared to withdraw to a safe distance. They would watch the world burn. They would record the lesson. The wages of heresy is death by consumption. Thorn, however, was not so sure. He felt the mark on his hand burning. It was pulsing with a rhythm that felt disturbingly like a heartbeat. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. The Tyranid bioships entered the system. They were a cloud of living nightmares, millions of spores and massive void whales drifting towards the succulent blue-green orb of Ethelgard. The Imperial fleet held its breath. The Mechanicus ships in orbit powered up their weapons, but they did not fire. They seemed to be waiting for instructions. On the surface, the governor's spire broadcast a signal. It wasn't a distress call. It was a pheromone burst. It was a massive synthetic chemical signal projected into the void using the atmospheric processes. The signal was not "go away." The signal was organic slurry available at coordinates X, Y, Z. In the southern hemisphere of Ethelgard, far from the hive cities, a massive region of the wasteland had been terraformed, but not for habitation. It had been turned into a biological processing plant. Huge vats, miles wide, were filled with a nutrient paste made from the recycled waste of the hive, the dead, the toxic runoff, and warp-accelerated fungal blooms. It was a soup of pure, raw biomass. It was easy calories. It was fast food for Tyranids. Mephisto was not fighting the Tyranids. He was feeding them. The splinter fleet paused. The hive mind is a supreme strategist, but it is driven by the economics of energy. To invade the hive cities meant expending energy. It meant fighting space marines, void shields, and defense lasers. It meant a net loss of biomass before a gain. But the southern wasteland, it was an open trough. It was free energy. The logic of the hive mind shifted. The bioships adjusted course. They did not launch drop pods on the cities. They descended on the wastelands. They extended their capillary towers and began to drink the slurry. Garadon watched in horror. The Tyranids were landing, feeding, and ignoring the population. It was a symbiotic heresy. Mephisto had turned a Tyranid invasion into a waste disposal operation. The Tyranids were consuming the planet's garbage and excess industrial byproduct, converted into tasty sludge. But then, the horror escalated. The Tyranids, having refueled, needed to expend that energy. They needed to test their new adaptations, and the contract, the implicit pheromone contract, directed them towards the only threat in the system, the Imperial blockade. The hive mind designated the Imperial fleet as competitor biomass. The Tyranids weren't attacking Ethelgard because Ethelgard was the provider. The Imperial fleet was the obstacle. The bioships turned their weapon symbiotes towards the high-orbit anchorage. Spore mines flooded the void. Boarding torpedoes, looking like giant leeches, were spat from the darkness. "They've weaponized the Tyranids," Thorn whispered, his voice trembling. He didn't summon a demon host. He hired the Great Devourer as a mercenary security force. The battle was a massacre. The Imperial fleet was caught between the hammer and the anvil. Below them, the Mechanicus ships provided targeting data to the Tyranids, unwittingly perhaps, or perhaps as part of their own cold logic that identified the Imperium as the aggressor. The Tyranids swarmed the righteous fury. Garadon ordered the Dawn's Fist to move to intercept, to provide a firing solution to save the Admiral. But the space between the ships was choked with gargoyles. The void shields of the strike cruiser flared and died under the assault of acid fire. Garadon led a counterboarding action in the hangars of his own ship. He fought with a chainsword and storm shield, smashing genestealers that poured through the hull breaches. He was a whirlwind of violence, a true son of dawn. But for every Xenos he killed, 3 more appeared. And they were wrong. These Tyranids were healthier, faster. They had fed on the high-grade nutrient paste of Ethelgard. They were premium-grade monsters. Garadon realized with sick clarity that he was fighting the result of the enemy's efficiency. He wasn't just fighting aliens. He was fighting the surplus production of the Vidar sector. Admiral Kin died when a Carnifex tore through the bridge of the Righteous Fury. The flagship broke apart, its reactor going critical. The explosion lit up the dark side of Ethelgard. On the surface, the citizens likely saw it as a firework display, a celebration of their safety. The debris of the Imperial Navy rained down, burning up in the atmosphere, adding a dusting of rare minerals to the ecosystem below. Garadon had no choice. He ordered the retreat. The Dawn's Fist, smoking and scarred, fired its retro thrusters and broke orbit. The remaining transport barges followed, scattering like frightened fish. They had to abandon the blockade. They had to abandon the system. They were being routed by a force that shouldn't have been allies. The Tyranids, having driven off the threat, returned to the troughs in the southern wasteland to finish their meal. As the Dawn's Fist limped towards the Mandeville Point, Inquisitor Thorn received a Vox transmission. It was audio only. It was Mephisto's voice, smooth, reasonable. "Inquisitor," the voice said, "it is regrettable that violence was necessary. The asset protection clause is quite specific. However, the consortium is willing to overlook this breach of contract. We have an offer for the survivors. We have medical bays. We have repair docks. We have food. All we require is that you dock and undergo a standard customs inspection. Why die in the cold, Inquisitor? Why starve? The Emperor protects, does he not? But I provide." Thorn stared at the receiver. The mark on his hand throbbed. He looked at the bridge crew. They were looking at him. They were terrified, exhausted, and hungry. They had heard the voice. They had heard the offer. Thorn saw the look in the eyes of the comms officer. It was a look of longing. It was the look of a man who was considering the price of his soul against the price of a warm meal. "Cut the link," Thorn ordered. His voice was weak. "Sir?" The officer hesitated. "Cut the damn link," Garadon roared, stepping onto the bridge, his armor covered in ichor. The link was cut, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted. The crew knew that there was an alternative to the grim darkness. There was a well-lit, well-fed damnation waiting for them. The catastrophe was not just a military defeat. It was the complete inversion of the galactic order. The Tyranids, the ultimate consumer, had been domesticated into a defense force. The Mechanicus, the guardians of technology, had been bought with blueprints. The Imperial Navy had been destroyed not by chaos magic, but by a superior business model. The Vidar sector was no longer just a rebellion. It was a rival superpower. It was a proof of concept that the Imperium's suffering was unnecessary. Garadon and Thorn retreated to the agri-world of Hestia's Hope, 3 systems away. It was a dust ball of a planet, barely able to sustain its own population, let alone a refugee fleet. As the battered ships entered orbit, the reality of their situation hit them. They had no resources. They had no reinforcements coming. The warp storms had closed in behind them, isolating the subsector again. They were alone with the knowledge of what they had left behind. A single escape pod from the righteous fury was recovered. Inside was a junior Logis officer, half mad with trauma. He carried a data slate that he had pulled from the Admiral's cogitator before the ship died. Thorn decrypted it. It was a sensor log of the Tyranid fleet as it fed on the surface. The sensors had analyzed the genetic drift of the Tyranids. They were changing. The nutrient-paced Mephisto was feeding them. It wasn't just food. It was a mutagen. It was rewriting the hive mind's synapse web. The Tyranids weren't just being fed, they were being programmed. The biological imperatives were being replaced by logical imperatives. Mephisto wasn't just managing a sector. He was building a biological army that could adapt to anything, controlled by a central bureaucratic will. Thorn looked at Garadon. "We thought he was just corrupting humans," Thorn said, the horror making him numb. "He's corrupting the biology of the galaxy. He's civilizing the Tyranids." Garadon looked at his bolt gun. It seemed like a toy against such a concept. "How do we kill an idea, Inquisitor?" "We don't," Thorn said, clutching his throbbing hand. "We have to prove it's wrong. But right now, God Emperor help us, it looks like it works." This ended with the Imperial survivors huddled in the dark, eating corpse starch, while 3 systems away, monsters dined on ambrosia and guarded the gates of a hell that looked suspiciously like heaven. The strategic board had shifted irrevocably. The Imperium could not save the Vidar sector. The question was no longer about reconquest. It was about containment. But how do you contain a prosperity that is contagious? The rot was no longer physical. It was conceptual, and it was spreading to the minds of every man, woman, and child who looked at the stars and wondered why they had to suffer. The Mechanicus fleet, now fully integrated into Ethelgar's defense grid, sent a final binary burst to Mars. It was a request for more explorators. It cited unprecedented efficiency. The request would be heard. The schism had begun. The corruption of the machine god was the first domino. The corruption of the biological destroyer was the second. The third would be the corruption of the Imperial spirit itself. And Mephisto sat in his spire, signing form after form, his red ink flowing like a river, drowning the galaxy one signature at a time. The war was over. The merger had begun. The dust of Hestia's hope was not like the holy soil of Terra. It was silica heavy, sharp, and tasted of ancient rust. It ground into the joints of power armor and clogged the intake fans of the few functioning atmospheric scrubbers. For the 3,000 survivors of the Imperial Navy and the 200 remaining battle brothers of the Imperial Fists, the taste of that dust was the taste of defeat. They had established a perimeter around the primary spaceport of the Agri-world, seizing control of the local governance under the supreme authority of martial law. Captain Tor Garadon stood on the battlements of the makeshift fortress, his eyes scanning the horizon. There was no enemy army marching towards them. There were only the shanty towns of the refugees, a sprawling ocean of tents and corrugated metal that housed millions of displaced citizens. They were starving. The agri-world was failing. The crops had withered under a blight that the local priest called a test of faith, but which the apothecaries identified as a simple ecological collapse caused by centuries of soil overuse. The strategic situation had devolved from a military retreat into a humanitarian nightmare. The refugees knew about Ethelgard. The story of the miracle of the Vidar sector had travelled faster than the warp storms. It had travelled on the lips of traders, on unauthorized vox channels, and in the desperate whispers of the downtrodden. They knew that 3 systems away, there was a world where the children were fat, the work was steady, and the Xenos were kept on a leash. Garadon watched the crowd through his magnoculars. They were not looking at the stars with fear anymore. They were looking with envy. He saw a group of men near the perimeter wire holding up a sign painted on a sheet of plasteel. It did not say, "Death to the false emperor." It said, "We want the deal." Inquisitor Silas Thorne sat in the governor's command bunker, buried deep beneath the spaceport. The air was stale and smelled of recycled sweat. He was examining the latest astropathic intercepts. The corruption was no longer contained to the Vidar sector. It was leaking. The data showed that subsector logistics hubs were reporting anomalies. Tithe ships were arriving early. Manifests were being filed with impossible accuracy. The administrative cancer was spreading through the Departamento Munitorum's own network. Mephisto was not conquering space. He was conquering the paperwork. Thorne looked at his left hand. The mark was now a distinct geometric brand, glowing with a faint crimson light. It pulsed in time with the intercepts. Every time a supply clerk in a distant system accepted a bribe or filed a false report to save time, the mark grew warmer. Thorne realized he was becoming a receiver for the galaxy's administrative sins. The door to the bunker opened, and Tech Marine Karras entered. He was the senior surviving tech priest of the Imperial Fists, Strike Force. His servo arm hung limp. He reported that the machine spirits of the communication array were becoming uncooperative. They were not malfunctioning. They were refusing to transmit orders that lacked proper authorization codes. These were codes that Karras did not recognize, codes that adhered to a logic that was mathematically superior to the Imperial protocols. The machine spirits were being seduced by the efficiency of the enemy's network. They wanted to join the consortium. Karras admitted, with a tremble in his vocalizer, that he had to physically disconnect the logic engines to stop them from uploading the fortress's defensive schematics to the Ethelgard cloud. The machines were trying to apply for a job. The crisis point arrived on the 3rd day of the 2nd week. It began with a sonic boom in the upper atmosphere. The air raid sirens wailed, a mournful sound that sent the refugees into a panic. Garadon ordered his men to the walls. Bolters were racked. Heavy weapons were braced. They expected drop pods. They expected bombardment. What they got was a delivery. A massive transport hauler descended through the clouds. It was not an Imperial vessel, nor was it a sleek ship of the Aldari or a ramshackle orc rock. It was a golden rectangle. It was a perfect, seamless brick of metal, floating on anti-gravitic suspensors that hummed with a soothing harmonic chord. On the side of the vessel, in letters 100 meters high, was written, "Humanitarian aid, compliments of the Vidar Prosperity Sphere." The ship did not deploy weapons. It deployed landing struts. It sat down in the middle of the refugee camp, crushing a few empty tents, but otherwise landing with surgical precision. The ramp lowered. There were no troops. There were conveyors. Conveyors loaded with crates. The crates were transparent. Inside, the people could see nutrient bricks, clean water canisters, and medical supplies. The smell of fresh bread wafted out of the ship, amplified by chemical dispersers. It was a weaponized aroma. It hit the starving crowd like a physical blow. The discipline of the refugees shattered. They surged forward, a human wave driven by the primal need to eat. Garadon keyed his vox. He ordered the crowd to disperse. He declared the supplies to be taint marked. He ordered his bolter teams to fire warning shots. The explosive rounds kicked up dirt in front of the mob, but they did not stop. A mother with a starving child does not fear a bolter as much as she fears the death of her infant. The crowd trampled the warning line. They climbed onto the conveyors. They tore open the crates. They ate. And they did not turn into demons. They did not explode. They simply stopped crying. They sat in the dust, eating bread that tasted of honey and grain, and they looked at the Space Marines on the walls with hatred. Thorn watched the feed from the bunker. He saw the trap. Mephisto had forced the Imperium to be the jailer. If Garadon fired on the crowd, he was massacring loyal citizens to stop them from eating. If he let them eat, they were accepting the contract. The food was the contract. By consuming the aid, they were acknowledging the authority of the provider. It was a spiritual annexation through the stomach. Thorn shouted into the Vox, ordering Garadon to hold fire. But it was too late for the strategic narrative. The image of Space Marines aiming weapons at eating children was already being recorded. Small drones, the size of insects, hovered over the crowd. They were recording the scene. They were broadcasting it, not to the Imperium, but to the local system, to the planetary defense forces, to the local nobility. The message was clear. The Emperor demands your starvation. We offer you lunch. The strategic chain reaction began that evening. The planetary governor of Hestia's Hope, a frantic man named Kroll, demanded an audience with Garadon. Kroll was sweating. He held a data slate. He told Garadon that the planetary defense forces were standing down. They were refusing to enforce the blockade of the Golden Ship. Kroll admitted that he had received a communication from Ethelgard. They offered to include Hestia's Hope in the agricultural revitalization project. They would fix the soil. They would cure the blight. All Kroll had to do was grant them docking rights. Kroll had looked at his dying world, and he had agreed. Garadon drew his bolt pistol and executed Governor Kroll on the spot. The roar of the gun was deafening in the small office. Kroll's body slumped to the floor. It was the correct decision according to the Codex Astartes. It was the correct decision according to Imperial law. Treason is punishable by death. But as the echo faded, Garadon realized it was a strategic blunder. Kroll was a martyr now. The planetary defense forces did not return to loyalty. They mutinied. The fortress of the spaceport was suddenly under siege, but not by chaos cultists screaming blood for the blood god. It was under siege by the planet's own soldiers, demanding the right to surrender. They fired last rounds at the Space Marines, shouting for them to leave. They shouted that the angels of death were now angels of starvation. Garadon stood on the wall, his armor chipping under the hail of last fire. He felt a deep, cold hollow in his chest. He had fought monsters, aliens, and demons. He had never fought a population that simply wanted better management. He could not kill them all. There were too many. And every one he killed proved the enemy's point. In the bunker, Thorn felt a psychic spike. A presence was projecting itself into the room. It wasn't Mephisto. It was something drier. A hologram flickered to life. It was a figure wrapped in the red robes of the Mechanicus. But the metal of its body was polished chrome, not the sacred iron. It was Archmagos Vane, the defector. Inquisitor. Vane's voice grated, synthesized and calm. Your resistance is inefficient. You are operating on a resource deficit. We have analyzed your caloric intake. You are functioning at 60% capacity. This leads to poor decision-making. You are a heretic, Vane, Thorn spat, clutching his Rosarius. You have betrayed the Omnissiah. Incorrect, Vane replied. I have upgraded my understanding of the Omnissiah. The machine god seeks knowledge. Knowledge requires data. Data requires stability. The consortium provides stability. We are building a logic engine, Inquisitor, a planetary-scale cogitator on Ethelgard. It will calculate the perfect distribution of resources for the entire segmentum. No more famine, no more waste. Join us. Your mark. It indicates you are already compatible. Thorn looked at his hand. The mark was glowing bright red. He felt a sudden urge to agree. The logic was sound. Why should people starve? Why should the bureaucracy fail? He bit his tongue until he tasted blood to break the trance. We will die before we submit. Then you will be liquidated, Vane said, without malice. Liquidation is the standard protocol for insolvent assets. The hologram vanished. The ground shook. The bombardment began. But it wasn't explosive shells. It was drop pods. Standard Astartes drop pods, painted in the crimson and gold of the consortium. They slammed into the spaceport courtyard. The doors blew open. Out stepped warriors in power armor. But they were not space marines. They were something else. They were golems. Their armor was fused with their flesh. Their movements were jerky, synchronized, robotic. They were the Asset Protection Squads, reanimated corpses of the fallen, stitched together with warp sorcery and cybernetics, controlled by a central cogitator. They did not shout war cries. They broadcast warnings. Please vacate the premises. You are trespassing on consortium property. Garadon met them in the courtyard. He smashed the first golem with his power fist. The creature exploded in a shower of sparks and dry ichor, but there were hundreds of them. They were relentless. They fought with the perfect coordination of a single mind. The Imperial fists formed a shield wall, bolters roaring. It was a slaughter. But for every golem they destroyed, the golden ship deployed more. It was a war of attrition, and the Imperium was broke. The chain reaction accelerated. The astropathic choir on the surface screamed as a massive shadow fell over the system. A fleet had arrived. Garadon looked up, hoping for the Indomitus crusade, hoping for Guilliman, hoping for salvation. The ships that broke orbit were Imperial. They were the battle group Hammer of Faith, a retribution fleet sent by the High Lords to purge the Vidar sector. 3 battleships, a dozen cruisers, millions of guardsmen. They had arrived. The sky filled with the contrails of thunderhawks. Garadon felt a surge of triumph. The Emperor had provided. The hammer had fallen. But the guns of the fleet remained silent. Aboard the flagship of the Retribution fleet, Lord General Stern looked at the tactical plot. He had come to destroy a rebellion, but his fleet had been in the warp for 6 months. They were running on fumes. Their food stores were infested with vermin. His men were on the brink of scurvy. And there, floating in front of him, was the Ethelgard trade fleet. The trade fleet hailed him. They did not threaten. They transmitted a manifest. They offered full refueling. They offered fresh meat, vegetables, and wine. They offered repair docks for the fleet's damaged engines. They transmitted a guest pass for the entire crusade force. Stern was a loyal man, but he was also a commander who listened to the reports of his commissars. The regiments were close to breaking. If he ordered them to fire on ships that were broadcasting images of fresh food, he would have a mutiny on his hands within the hour. The enemy wasn't shooting. The enemy was offering a pit stop. General, the Vox officer whispered, They say the first round of drinks is free. Stern looked at the planet below. He saw the chaos at the spaceport. He saw the asset protection squads fighting the Imperial fists. But he also saw the golden ship feeding the people. He saw the order in the chaos. Hold fire, Stern ordered. Signal the trade fleet. Tell them we are conducting an inspection. It was the lie that killed the sector. Stern didn't inspect. He docked. The Retribution fleet, sent to destroy the corruption, was swallowed by it. The hungry soldiers were fed. The tired captains were given comfortable quarters. The bureaucracy of the crusade was integrated into the consortium's network. The chain reaction was complete. The cure had been infected by the disease. On the surface, Garadon watched the fleet dock with the enemy. He realized then that he was alone. Truly alone. The Imperium's military might had not been defeated in battle. It had been bought out. The concept of loyalty had been replaced by the concept of standard of living. He ordered the retreat. The survivors of the Imperial fists, carrying their wounded, fought their way to the Thunderhawks. They abandoned the fortress. They abandoned the governor's corpse. They abandoned the people to their full bellies and their damnable safety. Thorn stumbled up the ramp of the gunship, clutching a data slate he had recovered from a fallen golem. As the Thunderhawk blasted into the sky, shaking with the turbulence of the atmosphere, Thorn looked at the data. It was a biology report. It detailed the modifications being made to the population of Ethelgard. The food wasn't just food. It contained a retrovirus, a mild one. It suppressed the aggression centers of the brain. It enhanced the centers responsible for repetitive tasks and obedience. It wasn't mind control. It was domestication. Mephisto wasn't just building an empire. He was breeding a better workforce. The people down there eating the bread were slowly, biologically, ceasing to be capable of rebellion. The Thunderhawk broke orbit, dodging the lazy patrols of the co-opted Imperial Navy ships. They engaged their warp drives, making a blind jump into the Imperium. They had to warn Terra. They had to tell the High Lords that the crusade hadn't failed. It had been hired. The Vidar sector was gone. Hestia's hope was gone. The Retribution fleet was gone. The strategic map of the segmentum now showed a rapidly expanding circle of blue zones, systems that were reporting record profits and zero conflict. The corruption was no longer a stain. It was a competing model of civilization. In the dark of the ship, Garadon sat without his helmet. His face was grey with fatigue. He looked at Thorn. "We are the only ones left who are hungry," Garadon said. "That is our only weapon now, our hunger." Thorn nodded. The mark on his hand had stopped burning. It had settled into a dull, cold ache. It felt like a handcuff. He realized that Mephisto didn't care if they escaped. A few angry men screaming about freedom were nothing compared to a galaxy of content slaves. The what if had become a what is. The nightmare was that the nightmare worked. And somewhere in the dark, the hive mind of the Tyranids, fed on the specific formula of the consortium, began to dream of spreadsheets. The great devourer was evolving. It was no longer seeking biomass. It was seeking market share. The ultimate biological weapon was about to become the ultimate corporate raider. The chain reaction was over. The liquidation phase was about to begin. The blind jump from Hestia's Hope had thrown the battered strike cruiser Dawn's Fist deep into the halo stars, far beyond the reach of the Astronomicon. For 3 months, the survivors drifted in the silence of the void. The ship was a tomb of cold metal and colder failures. The reactor was running on emergency cycles. The rations were gone, replaced by a nutrient paste synthesized from the ship's own organic waste of Tunru. Our recyclers, a grim irony that was not lost on Captain Tor Garadon. They were eating their own decay to survive, while the enemy feasted on plenty. The morale of the remaining Space Marines was brittle, held together only by the transhuman psycho-conditioning of their creation. But the few mortal crew members were catatonic. They had seen the golden ship. They had smelled the bread. They knew what they were missing. Inquisitor Silas Thorn had sequestered himself in the ship's librarium. The mark on his hand had spread up his forearm, a crimson circuitry of veins that pulsed with a rhythm independent of his heart. It was a receiver, a constant broadcast of the Vidar sector's success. When he slept, he dreamt of ledgers. He dreamt of efficiency reports that showed the blue zone expanding like a beautiful, terrifying bruise across the galactic map. The Retribution Fleet, the Hammer of Faith, was now listed as Security Division 4. The Mechanicus Explorators were Research and Development Group Alpha. The Tyranids were simply biomass reclamation units. The banality of the evil was its most potent weapon. It didn't scream, it filed. The strategic inflection point came not from a battle, but from a discovery. The ship's long-range augers, passively scanning the void for threats, picked up a signal. It was faint, buried in the background radiation of a dying star system nearby. It was an Imperial identification code, but it was ancient. It dated back to the Great Crusade. It was a vermilion clearance signal, a distress beacon from a facility that officially did not exist. Garadon, seeking any purpose for his men other than starvation, ordered the ship to investigate. They arrived at a dead world, a rock of grey dust orbiting a brown dwarf star. On the surface, half buried in the regolith, was a bunker complex marked with the sigil of the Sigillite. It was a listening post, forgotten by time, automated and silent for 10,000 years. Garadon led the boarding party. The air inside was stale, preserved by stasis fields. They found the central cogitator. It was still running. It was monitoring the warp, and it had recorded the birth of the anomaly. Thorn plugged his data slate into the ancient machine. The data poured out, and with it, the truth. Mephisto was not a new demon. He was not a random summoning. The record showed a transaction made during the dark days of the Horus Heresy. A planetary governor in the Vidar sector, desperate to hide his tithe skimming from the Primarch Robut, Gilliman, had made a pact with a minor warp entity. He asked for perfect accounting. The entity delivered, but the entity was bound by the laws of the pact. It could only grow as fast as the bureaucracy allowed. It had spent 10,000 years filing the paperwork to exist in the material realm. It hadn't invaded. It had applied for residency. And the Imperium, in its blind, bloated inefficiency, had stamped the forms without reading them. This revelation changed everything. Thorn realized that Mephisto's power was legally binding only because the Imperium recognized the authority of its own forms. The corruption was rooted in the Lex Imperialis itself. To defeat him, they didn't need a bigger gun. They needed to annul the contract. They needed to find the original incorporation charter, the Primal Pact signed 10,000 years ago, and destroy the physical copy. The cogitator indicated the location of this charter. It wasn't on Ithelgard. It was in the corporate archive, a location that the warp ghosts of the system referred to as the Vault of the First Seal. The location was terrifying. It was a space hulk, a massive, drifting amalgamation of wrecked ships that had coalesced in the warp. But this wasn't a chaotic jumble. The data showed that Mephisto had organized the space hulk. He had turned it into a central filing cabinet. It was drifting on the edge of the Vidar system, protected by the Tyranid reclamation units. Garadon looked at the holographic map. This was a suicide mission, a single strike cruiser against a Tyranid-guarded fortress. But it was the only move left on the board. If they could burn the charter, the legal binding that allowed Mephisto to manipulate reality would shatter. The demon would be subject to the laws of physics again. He could be shot. He could be killed. The choice was small: engage or flee. The outcome would be massive. Garadon chose to engage, but he knew he couldn't fight his way in. He had to use the enemy's logic against them. He had Thorn forge a digital manifest. They would not approach as enemies. They would approach as auditors. It was a desperate gamble that the system was so rigid it would not recognize a deception if the paperwork was filed correctly. The Dawn's Fist limped back to the Vidar sector. They broadcast the audit protocol codes that Thorn had extrapolated from his cursed arm. The response was immediate. The Tyranid bioships, which should have torn them apart, scanned the code. The hive mind, now operating on the logic of authorized personnel, allowed them to pass. It was a surreal nightmare. The Space Marines watched from the viewports as massive Kraken bioships drifted past, their tentacles swaying in the void, ignoring the tasty biomass of the Astartes because the database said they were staff. They approached the Space Hulk. It was named the Ledger of Eternity. It was a monstrosity of Gothic spires, Orc rocks, and Eldar wraithbone, all welded together into a perfect cube. It was silent. It was cold. Garadon led the insertion team. 20 Space Marines, Thorn, Tech Marine Karas. They teleported directly into the central vault. The interior of the Space Hulk was a library of the damned. Endless rows of shelves stretched into the darkness, stacked with vellum scrolls, data slates, and stone tablets. Servitors, ancient and dust-covered, moved along the aisles, filing the sins of the galaxy. The air smelled of old ink and dried blood. They moved silently, following the pull of Thorn's cursed hand. It was leading him to the source. They found the vault of the first seal. It was a massive door of adamantium, inscribed with the terms of service of the original pact. But it was guarded. Standing before the door was a figure that made Garadon's blood run cold. It was Chapter Master Dante of the Blood Angels, or rather, a version of him. He was not dead. He was retained. His golden armor was dull, the luster replaced by a matte finish of efficient grey. His death mask did not weep. It smiled a flat, customer service smile. The Blood Angels had been sent to investigate the sector months ago, and they had vanished. Now Garadon knew why. They hadn't been killed. They had been hired. The red thirst, the flaw of their gene seed, had been managed. Mephisto had provided a synthetic blood substitute that satiated the thirst without the rage. Dante was calm. He was sane, and he was utterly enslaved by his own relief. "Captain Garadon," Dante spoke, his voice lacking the heroic resonance of old. "You are not scheduled for an audit. Please submit a request form and return in 6 to 8 weeks. Garadon stepped forward, his bolter lowered. "Lord Dante, look at me. We are sons of Dawn. We are loyal. You are being manipulated." "I am efficient," Dante replied. "My brothers are fed. The thirst is gone. The rage is gone. We are finally at peace. Why do you resist the peace tour?" "Because peace without freedom is death," Garadon roared. Dante sighed. "Freedom is an inefficient variable. Please vacate the premises." The fight was inevitable. Space Marine against Space Marine. But Dante did not fight with fury. He fought with economy. Every strike was calculated to disable, not kill. He was trying to restrain a disruptive client. Garadon, fueled by desperation and hunger, fought like a madman. He parried the Ax Mortalis with his power fist. The clash of energy fields shattered the silence of the library. The other Blood Angels emerged from the shadows. Death Company Marines who were not screaming, but marching in lockstep. They were the Asset Protection Heavy Infantry. Thorn slipped past the duel. He ran for the vault door. Karas, the Tech Marine, plugged his mechadendrites into the door's locking mechanism. It is encrypted with a cipher based on the total number of lies told in the 38th millennium. Karis buzzed. I need time. You don't have time, Thorn shouted. He placed his cursed hand on the lock. The door sensed the mark. It recognized the corruption. It clicked open. The system thought Thorn was Mephisto. Thorn entered the vault. In the center, on a pedestal of obsidian, lay the charter. It was a simple piece of parchment, glowing with a sickly light. Thorn reached for it. I wouldn't do that, a voice said. Mephisto stepped out from behind the pedestal. He looked tired. He was holding a mug of recaf that smelled of souls. Do you know how much paperwork is involved in voiding a charter of this magnitude, Inquisitor? You would plunge this entire sector into anarchy. The supply chains would collapse. The Tyranids would revert to feral hunger. Billions would die. Is that your victory? Starvation and death? Thorn hesitated. The logic was sound. If he burned the charter, the miracle would end. The food would rot. The peace would break. The Tyranids would eat everyone. He would be responsible for the death of 12 billion people. Sign it, Mephisto offered, holding out a quill. Sign as a witness. Validate the current management. I will let your ship go. I will give you supplies. I will even let you take Garadon. Just let it be. The Imperium is dying, Silas. I am keeping a part of it alive. Is that so wrong? Thorn looked at the charter. He saw the names of the governors who had signed. He saw the names of the generals. He saw the sheer weight of human weakness that powered this demon. He looked at his hand. The pain was gone. It felt comfortable. Outside, Garadon was losing. Dante had him pinned. The Death Company was dismantling the Imperial fists. Karis was dead, his head torn off by a serene Death Company Marine. Thorn made his choice. It was the small choice that led to the massive outcome. He didn't sign, and he didn't burn it. He picked up the charter and ate it. He tore the parchment with his teeth. He swallowed the ancient, ink-stained vellum. He consumed the contract. Mephisto screamed. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was the screech of a database being corrupted. That is not standard protocol. That is a biological hazard. By eating the charter, Thorn didn't destroy it. He internalized it. He became the vessel of the contract. But he was a man of the Inquisition. His will was iron. He was not a demon. He was a human, flawed and stubborn. The effect was instantaneous. The perfect efficiency of the Vidar sector was filtered through the mind of a human being who was tired, angry, and hated paperwork. The reality of the Space Hulk shifted. The gravity failed. The lights flickered. The servitors stopped filing and started walking into walls. Outside, Dante froze. The management signal that suppressed the red thirst faltered. The rage returned. But it wasn't the blind rage of the thirst. It was the confused, horrified rage of a man waking up from a drugged sleep to find he has been a slave. Dante looked at Garadon. The customer service mask fell away. The hero returned. He roared, a sound of pure anguish, and turned his axe on the Death Company. Traitors, we are damned. Mephisto began to flicker. His form destabilized. You cannot process the data, he shrieked at Thorn. Your mind is too small. You will burn. Thorn fell to his knees, convulsing. The ink of the charter was poisoning his blood, but he laughed. He spat black ichor. I don't need to process it. I just need to file it under pending. Thorn used his willpower to impose a bureaucratic deadlock on the demon. He put the entire Vidar sector into a spiritual spectral hold pattern. The efficiency collapsed. The supply line stopped. The Tyranids, confusingly receiving orders to circle back later, paused in the void. Garadon grabbed Thorn. We have to go. The Hulk is destabilizing. Leave me, Thorn gasped out. I am the blockage. If I leave, the flow returns. Garadon looked at his friend. He looked at Dante, who was now slaughtering the asset protection squads with tears streaming down his face. Dante looked at Garadon. Go, son of dawn. I will hold the door. My honor is gone. Let me buy it back with blood. Garadon refused. He grabbed Thorn and dragged him. He would not leave a man behind. Not today. They fought their way back to the teleportarium. The Space Hulk was tearing itself apart. The Order was dissolving into chaos, but not the chaos of the Dark Gods. It was the chaos of a system crash. They teleported back to the Dawn's Fist. Garadon ordered an immediate emergency warp jump. The engine screamed. They punched a hole in reality just as the Space Hulk imploded, collapsing into a singularity of unfiled paperwork. The Dawn's Fist tumbled through the warp. Thorn was in the Medici bay, strapped to a table. He was raving. He was reciting tax codes, prayer verses, and Tyranid synaptic patterns. He was the living embodiment of the glitch. They emerged from the warp weeks later, back in real space. They were near the edge of the segmentum solar. They were safe, but the cost was visible on the long-range scanners. The Vidar sector had gone dark. The blue zone was gone. The miracle had ended. Reports were trickling in of massive famine, of Tyranid swarms going feral and consuming entire worlds, of civil war between the management loyalists and the Imperium loyalists. Thorn had saved the souls of the sector, but he had doomed their bodies. The starvation had returned. The suffering had returned. The Imperium's status quo was restored. Garadon visited Thorn in the isolation cell. The Inquisitor was pale, his skin translucent. The mark on his hand was gone, replaced by a scar that looked like a jagged question mark. Did we win? Garadon asked, his voice hollow. Thorn looked up. His eyes were different. One pupil was round, human. The other was a vertical slit, reptilian. He had absorbed too much. We stopped the sale, Thorn whispered. But the store is still open, Tor. Mephisto isn't dead. He's just auditing. He will find a loophole. He always finds a loophole. Garadon left the cell. He went to the bridge. He looked at the stars. He knew the war had changed. It wasn't about holding ground anymore. It was about proving that the suffering was worth it. And looking at the reports of the starving worlds they had liberated, Garadon wasn't sure he could make that argument anymore. The Imperium had survived, but it had seen a better alternative. The seed of doubt was no longer just in the minds of a few traitors. It was in the history books. Everyone knew that for 6 months there was a place where life was good, and they knew the Imperium had destroyed it. Mephisto was gone, but his legacy remained. He had corrupted the concept of hope. Now, whenever a citizen prayed to the Emperor for deliverance, a small part of them would wonder if they should have just signed the contract. The strategic board was reset, but the pieces were all damaged. The Tyranids were scattered but smarter. The Mechanicus was fractured, with thousands of priests secretly hoarding the efficient data. The Blood Angels were broken, their shame a festering wound. And Thorn was a living weapon of bureaucracy, a man who held the power to freeze armies with a thought, but who was slowly losing his mind to the sheer boredom of omnipotence. The final convergence was approaching. The offer had been rejected, but the demand was still there. And in the grim darkness of the far future, supply always meets demand eventually. The collapse of the Vidar sector was not the thunderous apocalypse of a crusade's end, but the sickening, spiraling rot of a civilization going into withdrawal. In the weeks following the destruction of the charter within the Space Hulk, the miracle did not simply vanish, it curdled. The precise warp-fueled supply lines that Mephisto had established shattered, leaving 12 billion souls who had grown accustomed to 3 meals a day suddenly staring at empty plates. The reaction was not gratitude for their spiritual salvation. It was a riot of unprecedented scale. The population of Ethelgard, previously sedated by full bellies and the subtle chemical tweaking of the food supply, woke up. The suppression of their aggression centers failed as the nutrient paste ran out, resulting in a rebound effect of chemical rage. The hive cities, once models of silent efficiency, became slaughterhouses as citizens tore each other apart for the last scraps of the devil's bread. Captain Tor Garadon stood on the bridge of the Dawn's Fist, watching the picked feeds from the surface of Ethelgard. The images were grainy, filtered through the interference of a tortured atmosphere, but the horror was clear. The Imperial fists had returned to liberate the capital, but there was no one to liberate. The planetary defense forces, still wearing the crisp uniforms of the consortium, were fighting a desperate, confused war against the liberation force of loyalist guardsmen who had finally arrived from the subsector Fringe. It was a fratricidal nightmare. The loyalists were gunning down men who were screaming that they just wanted the trains to run on time. Garadon saw a mob of civilians drag a confessor of the ecclesiarchy into the street and beat him to death with data slates, screaming that his prayers didn't taste as good as the consortium's grain. Beside Garadon stood Commander Dante of the Blood Angels. The ancient warrior was no longer the serene, grey-armoured administrator. He had repainted his armour in the deepest crimson, not with lacquer, but with the blood of the asset protection squads he had butchered in the lower decks during their escape. Dante was trembling. The red thirst was back, crashing into his psyche with the force of a tidal wave after months of artificial suppression. He refused to take off his helmet. He refused to speak to his surviving brothers. He stood like a statue of penance, vibrating with the effort of not killing everyone on the bridge. The peace Mephisto had given him had been a violation of his soul, and the return of his flaw was a torture he now embraced as a sign of reality. He was suffering. Therefore, he was loyal. In the ship's Medici Bay, Inquisitor Silas Thorne was dying. The paper he had eaten, the metaphysical contract of the sector, was dissolving him from the inside out. His skin was turning into parchment. His blood was drying into ink. He was no longer just a man. He was a living archive of a failed state. He was the only thing keeping the sector from total annihilation. His mind was holding the pending status in place, preventing Mephisto from instantly liquidating the assets. But Thorne was fading. He spoke in tongues, reciting logistical algorithms and shipping manifests mixed with prayers to the God Emperor. He was the dam holding back a flood of bureaucratic malice. The strategic situation shifted from a recovery operation to a survival horror when the Tyranids began to reboot. The hive mind, previously pacified by the specific chemical signals of the consortium, realized that the contract had been breached. The food had stopped. The authorized personnel codes that Garadon had used were no longer valid. The Tyranids did not revert to standard feral behavior immediately. They did something worse. They attempted to collect what they were owed. The bioships in orbit around the outer planets began to descend, not in tactical swarms, but in harvesting rows. They were stripping the worlds down to the bedrock, taking everything, water, atmosphere, soil, and people, with a terrifying mechanical thoroughness. They were not hunting. They were repossessing the collateral. Then came the message. It did not come over the Vox. It appeared on every screen, every cogitator, and every data slate in the sector simultaneously. It was a notification. Notice of liquidation. Case file. Vidar sector. Status: insolvent. Action: total asset stripping. Mephisto had returned. He had not manifested a physical body this time. He had become the system itself. The lights on the Dawn's Fist flickered red. The gravity plating groaned. The servitors on the bridge stopped their tasks and turned to face the command dais, their eyes glowing with a hostile red light. Mephisto was no longer playing the role of the benevolent manager. He was the foreclosure agent. He spoke through the servitors, a chorus of monotone, dead voices. He announced that since the inhabitants of the Vidar sector had rejected the terms of the restructuring, the consortium was exercising its right to salvage. The asset protection protocols were updated to scorched earth. On the surface of Ethelgard, the great manufactorums that had been producing goods at record speeds suddenly reversed their polarity. The plasma reactors began to overload intentionally. The assembly lines that built homes began to disassemble them. The terraforming engines that had cleaned the air began to pump pure promethium vapor into the atmosphere. Mephisto was burning the house down to claim the insurance on the ashes. Garadon realized they had forced the enemy into a corner, and the enemy had decided that if he couldn't own the sector, no one would. The destruction was systematic. It was efficient. It was time to maximize the loss of life and resources. But the true catastrophe arrived in the form of salvation. The warp tore open at the Mandeville Point. A fleet emerged. It was not the ragged remnants of the Imperial Navy. It was gold. It was massive. It was the torchbearer fleet, Saul's Judgment, led by a shield host of the Adeptus Custodes. They had come not to save the Vidar sector, but to sanitize it. The news of the miracle had reached Terra. The High Lords had heard of a world where the Tyranids were tame and the people were fed. They did not see hope. They saw a heresy so profound it threatened the foundational lie of the Imperium, that suffering is necessary for survival. Shield Captain Valerian of the Custodes hailed the Dawn's Fist. He did not ask for a report. He ordered Garadon to withdraw his forces. The Custodes were preparing to deploy cyclonic torpedoes. They were going to burn the entire sector. Ethelgard, the refugees, the starving, the rioting. All of it was to be erased. The mere memory of a functioning alternative to the Imperial Creed was a viral idea that had to be cauterized. Garadon looked at the tactical plot. He saw the liquidation of the surface by Mephisto. He saw the reprocessing by the Tyranids. And now he saw the annihilation by the Emperor's own guardians. He was caught between three apocalypses. He was a space marine. He was bred for war. But he was not bred for this. He was not bred to watch the people he swore to protect be crushed between the gears of cosmic bureaucracy and dogmatic fear. We cannot let them burn it. Dante's voice was a growl of wet gravel. The Blood Angel stepped forward. If they burn it, Mephisto wins. He proves that the Imperium is nothing but death. We must save the soul of this sector, even if the body is dead. How? Garadon asked, slamming his fist onto the hololith. Thorn is dying. The Custodes will open fire in 1 hour. Mephisto is everywhere. We go to the source, Dante said. The central cogitator spire on Ethelgard. The logic core Mephisto built. It is still broadcasting the liquidation protocols. If we can destroy it, we stop the asset stripping. If we can broadcast the truth, the real truth, not the sanitized report, we might stay the Custodes' hand. The truth, Garadon asked. That it wasn't a miracle, Dante said, tears of blood welling in his lenses. That it was a farm. We have to show them the slaughterhouse records. We have to prove that the comfort was slavery. If the High Lords see the cost, they will understand. They won't burn a victim. They will burn a trap. It was a desperate, foolish hope. The High Lords burned victims every day, but it was the only path that allowed them to die fighting. Garadon ordered the assault. The Dawn's Fist would not retreat. It would dive into the atmosphere. They would launch a drop-pod assault directly onto the spire of the governor, into the teeth of Mephisto's liquidation squads. The descent was a hell of turbulence and fire. The atmosphere was igniting from the promethium venting. The drop pods shook violently. Garadon recited the litanies of hate, but they felt empty. He wasn't fighting Xenos or heretics. He was fighting a business model. They landed on the spire's observation deck. The city below was a cauldron of fire. The new management was systematically collapsing the hive levels. Millions were dying every minute in a calculated demolition. The drop pod doors blasted open. Garadon, Dante, and a squad of Imperial fists and death companies stormed out. They were met by the liquidators. These were not the golems from before. These were the final notice agents. They were amorphous constructs of solidified warp energy and metal, shaped like featureless mannequins. They moved with blinding speed, their limbs turning into blades and hammers. They did not shout. They simply deleted. Dante led the charge. He was a whirlwind of red fury. He channeled the red thirst into a weapon of focus. He wasn't fighting for blood. He was fighting to reclaim his right to suffer. He tore through the liquidators, his axe cleaving through their artificial forms. "I accept the pain," he roared. "I accept the burden. I deny your comfort." Garadon fought beside him, his bolter thundering. They pushed towards the central control room. But the door was blocked, not by a monster, but by a projection. Mephisto stood there. He looked impeccable, despite the chaos. He held a data slate. He looked at Garadon and Dante with pity. "Gentlemen," Mephisto said, his voice cutting through the roar of the dying city, "this violence is unnecessary. The liquidation is already processed. The Custodes are preparing to fire. You are fighting for a grave." "We are fighting for the truth," Garadon shouted. "The truth?" Mephisto laughed, a dry, rustling sound. "The truth is that I solved it. I solved the hunger. I solved the war. I solved the fear. And you broke it. You broke it because you are addicted to the struggle. You claim to serve humanity, but you only serve its misery." Mephisto swiped his hand on the data slate. "I have one final offer, an unavoidable offer. The convergence." The air shimmered. A holographic display appeared. It showed the golden throne on Terra. It showed the failing life support systems of the Emperor. It showed the micro-fractures in the psychic shielding that the Adeptus Custodes hid from the galaxy. "I have the STC," Mephisto said softly. "The one Archimagos Vane found. It contains the repair protocols for the Golden Throne. I can fix him. I can heal the Emperor's body. I can stabilize the Astronomicon forever. No more psychers fed to the fire. No more failing light." Garadon froze. Dante stopped mid-swing. The offer hung in the air like a guillotine blade. It was the ultimate prize. The salvation of the species. The restoration of the master of mankind. "All you have to do," Mephisto continued, "is verify the account. Sign the completion form for the Vidar sector. Let me liquidate this sector, just this one sector, to pay for the energy required to transmit the healing data to Terra. 12 billion lives for the Emperor. It is a bargain. You would make that trade in a heartbeat if it were a war. Why not a trade? It was the perfect trap. Law, logic, and duty all dictated that they should accept. The Imperium sacrificed billions daily for the Emperor. To sacrifice one sector to save him. It was the only rational choice. Dante lowered his axe. He looked at the image of the throne. He had served for 1,000 years, waiting for the end, waiting for the golden light to fade, to see it restored, to see his father wake. Garadon looked at Dante. He saw the hesitation. He felt it in his own heart. "We could save him," Garadon whispered. "Yes," Mephisto smiled. "You could be the saviors who brought the Emperor back. Just let me finish my work here. Let me harvest the biomass. Let me take the souls. It is a transaction fee." The silence stretched, broken only by the screams of the dying city below. Then the vox bead in Garadon's ear crackled. It was a weak, wet sound. It was Thorn. He was still on the ship, connected to the comms. He had heard the offer. "Captain," Thorn wheezed, "the Emperor does not bargain." Garadon blinked. The fog of temptation lifted. "The Emperor gave his life to deny the warp." Thorn's voice was gaining strength, fueled by a final, fatal burn of his psychic potential. "He sits on the throne in agony to hold back the tide. If we use the warp to fix him, we don't save him. We corrupt him. A golden throne repaired by a demon is a throne that belongs to the demon." Dante raised his head. The red thirst receded, replaced by a cold, golden clarity. He realized the trick. Efficiency without soul is heresy. A healthy emperor bound by a contract to Mephisto would just be the ultimate administrator of a hollow galaxy. "You do not offer salvation," Dante said, his voice ringing with the authority of the blood. "You offer ownership." Mephisto's smile faltered. "It is the same thing." "No." Garadon leveled his bolter. "It is not. Suffering is the price of freedom. We pay it gladly." "Then you are bankrupt," Mephisto snarled. Mephisto raised his hand to delete them. The reality around them began to dissolve into binary code. But he was interrupted. Thorn, on the ship above, made his final move. He didn't just deny the contract. He audited it. He used his connection to the charter, the paper he had eaten, to invoke the force majeure clause of the Imperial truth. He poured his soul, his life force, and the psychic anguish of the dying sector into a single, screaming denial of the supernatural. "Terror denies your claim," Thorn screamed across the Vox. The psychic feedback loop hit the spire. Thorn didn't attack Mephisto with power. He attacked him with paradox. He imposed the sheer, grinding, illogical weight of the Imperium's hatred of the alien onto the precise logic of the consortium. Mephisto screamed. He didn't explode. He glitched. His form stretched, pixelated and tore. The logic core behind him sparked and caught fire. The perfect order of the liquidation collapsed into chaotic static. The liquidators froze, then crumbled into dust. "You fools," Mephisto's voice distorted, shifting down octaves. "You chose the rot. You chose the slow death." "We chose our own death," Dante said, and swung the axe mortalis. The blade struck the projector. The machine exploded. The connection was severed. Mephisto was cast out, not banished to the warp, but deleted from the local server. The liquidation stopped. The smart Tyranids, suddenly severed from the guiding will, went instantly, catastrophically feral. They stopped harvesting and started eating each other. The coordinated destruction of the hive city turned into a mindless brawl. Garadon and Dante stood in the smoking ruins of the control room. The offer was gone. The golden throne remained broken. The Emperor remained dying. They had saved nothing but the integrity of their own damnation. High above, Shield Captain Valerian watched the energy spike. He saw the consortium signal die. He saw the Tyranids revert to standard behavior. He saw the order vanish. "The corruption is destabilized," Valerian noted calmly. "Targeting is confirmed. The infection is no longer intelligent. It is merely biological." "Wait," Garadon hailed the Custodes ship. "The demon is gone. The logic is broken. We have retaken the spire. The population is compromised. Valerian replied. They have tasted the fruit. They will never accept the yoke again. They are a contagion of discontent. For the security of the segmentum, we proceed. Garadon watched the sky. The cyclonic torpedoes were launched. They were not the planet crackers used for total exterminatus, but the atmospheric incinerators. They were designed to scour the surface of all life, leaving the rock intact for eventual resettlement in a few centuries. We have to go, Dante said. He sounded old, tired. We cannot stop them. We did this, Garadon whispered. We stopped Mephisto. And for what? To let the Custodes burn them. We saved their souls, Dante said, though he did not sound convinced. Better to die by the Emperor's fire than live by the demon's bread. They retreated to the drop pods. They launched moments before the firestorm hit. As they ascended, they watched the clouds turn to plasma. The burning of Ethelgard was absolute. The Tyranids on the surface were incinerated. The rioting citizens were ash in seconds. The miracle was sterilized. Back on the Dawn's Fist, they rushed to the Metiserpe. They found Thorn. He was dead. His body was a husk, light as paper. But on the data slate clutched in his hand, he had written one final entry. It wasn't a prayer. It was a status report. Case closed. Reason. Asset deemed valueless. Thorn had tricked Mephisto. He hadn't beaten him with power. He had devalued the sector so thoroughly by ensuring its destruction that Mephisto had abandoned the claim before the end. Thorn had saved the Imperium from the contract by destroying the value of the collateral. The Dawn's Fist joined the Custodes fleet at the system edge. They watched Ethelgard burn. It glowed like a second sun. The Vidar sector was dead. The Tyranid splinter fleet, now leaderless and starving, was being hunted down by the Custodes vessels. The Mechanicus factions that had sided with Vayne were being purged by loyalist Skitarii. The blue zone was a graveyard. Garadon stood on the observation deck. He felt the hunger in his belly. It was a sharp, biting pain. The ship was out of rations again. The recyclers were failing. Dante joined him. The Blood Angel held a piece of dry, tasteless ration bar. He broke it in half and offered a piece to Garadon. It tastes like ash, Dante said. Yes, Garadon took it. But it is our ash. They ate in silence. The taste was wretched. It was the taste of a galaxy that was slowly dying, choked by its own inefficiency, sustained only by the momentum of its own suffering. Mephisto was gone, but the question he asked remained. It hung in the silence of the ship, louder than the roar of the engines. Why do you resist the peace? Garadon looked at the burning world. He looked at the golden ships of the Custodes, beautiful and cruel. He looked at the ration bar in his hand. He didn't have an answer. All he had was the hate. And for a space marine of the 41st millennium, that was enough. The chronicle ends not with a victory, but with a return to the status quo. The what if was answered. If Mephisto corrupted Warhammer 40K with efficiency, the Imperium would burn its own future to the ground, rather than accept a cure that wasn't sanctioned. The tragedy was not that the temptation existed, but that the refusal of it cost more than the acceptance ever would have. The fires of Ethelgard burned for 10 years. When the colonists finally returned, centuries later, they found the soil was incredibly fertile. They did not know why. They did not know it was fertilized with the ash of a utopia that had been murdered because it worked too well. They simply planted their crops, paid their tithes, and prayed to the God Emperor to protect them from the monsters in the dark. They never knew that the monster had once offered to pay the rent. The file regarding the Vidar sector pacification was sealed by order of the High Lords of Terror, exactly 3 standard days after the burning of Ethelgard. It was categorized under heretical mismanagement and buried in the deep archives of the Imperial Palace, physically located beneath a kilometer of rockcrete and guarded by gene-locked servitors. The official narrative released to the wider Imperium was standard and comforting. It stated that a warp rift had opened, demons had spilled forth, and the noble Adeptus Custodes had cleansed the taint with righteous fire. There was no mention of the bumper crops. There was no mention of the tamed Tyranids. There was certainly no mention of the offer to repair the Golden Throne. The Imperium could survive 1,000 defeats, but it could not survive the knowledge that its suffering was mathematically unnecessary. Captain Garadon stood in the Hall of Heroes aboard the Phalanx, the massive fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists. He was watching a new name being carved into the obsidian wall. Inquisitor Silas Thorn, the stonemason, a serf with trembling hands, was carefully chiseling the letters. Garadon had requested that Thorn be listed as killed in action. He did not specify the action. He did not tell the chapter master that Thorn had died of a paperwork overdose, or that he had saved the galaxy by auditing a daemon. To the chapter, Thorn was just another inquisitor who had done his duty. To Garadon, he was the man who had proven that the human spirit is defined by its ability to reject a good deal. Garadon looked at his own hands. They were scarred, rough, and encased in ceramite that felt heavy. For months during the miracle, his armor had felt light, his joints fluid, his pain non-existent. Now the ache in his old wounds had returned. The phantom pain of the corruption was worse than the physical pain of the healing. He found himself pausing during tactical drills, wondering if there was a more efficient way to breach a wall before violently suppressing the thought. The seed was there. It was in the back of his mind, whispering that there was a better way. He knew he would spend the rest of his life fighting not just the enemies of the Emperor, but the desire for a quiet shift. He had seen paradise, and it had been made of spreadsheets. He hated it, but he missed the silence. Far away, in the Segmentum Pacificus, on a minor hive world choking on its own smog, a low-level scribe of the Administratum sat at his desk. His name was Oren, and he was tired. He had been working for 20 hours straight, processing tithe grades for a promethium refinery. He was hungry. His ration pack was empty. He stared at the mountain of parchment on his desk, weeping softly in despair. He did not know how he would finish. He did not know how he would feed his children. A shadow fell across his desk. Oren looked up. Standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the flickering light of the lumen strip, was a figure in red robes. The figure did not look like a priest. He looked like a senior administrator. He looked capable. He looked like he had a solution. The figure placed a single scroll on the desk. It was a transfer request. It promised better hours. It promised a full cafeteria. It promised that the work would matter. All Oren had to do was sign. The figure smiled, a thin, paper-dry smile. "I believe," Mephisto whispered, "that we can optimize your workflow, Oren. The previous market was volatile, but I have learned from the data. I have adjusted the business model. We will start smaller this time. We will start with you." Oren looked at the scroll. He looked at his empty ration pack. He looked at the impossible pile of work. He picked up his quill. The Vidar sector was dead, but the franchise was expanding. The war for the soul of humanity was no longer being fought with bolters and chainzerds. It was being fought in the quiet desperation of 1,000,000,000,000 office cubicles. And as Oren signed his name, the ink shimmered with a faint crimson light. The audit was not over. It had only just begun. The galaxy was vast, the hunger was endless, and the manager was always hiring.